Get ready to dive into some really fascinating stuff today.
Oh, I love a good deep dive.
Me too, especially when we get to time travel a bit.
Ooh. Where are we headed?
Back to 1934.
Wow, almost a century ago.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at how people back then viewed sexual perversion.
That's a topic that's definitely evolved over the years.
No kidding. And we've got this article from the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine to guide us.
The Proceedings always has some gems in there.
Seriously. And let me tell you, some of the theories in this article are, well, let's just say they might raise a few eyebrows today.
I can imagine. So what kind of ideas are we talking about?
Okay, so the first article we're looking at jumps right into this theory, connecting sexual perversion to physical immaturity.
Okay, so like a biological explanation?
Yeah, they basically argue that if a man's sexual functions aren't fully developed, it can lead to these
infantile reactions?
Yeah, exactly. They call them infantile reactions, and somehow that's supposed to turn into perversions.
That's a pretty bold claim. I mean, today we understand that physical development doesn't necessarily equal sexual maturity, right? There's so much more to it than that.
Totally. It feels like they're trying to oversimplify something incredibly complex.
And you have to wonder how much the cultural norms of the 1930s were shaping their views.
Right. It was a completely different time with different social expectations and a much more limited understanding of psychology in general.
Absolutely. But it's important to acknowledge that historical context to really understand where they were coming from.
For sure. And to be fair to the article, it does go on to say that, while physical immaturity might play some role, the real driving forces behind most sexual perversions are probably psychological.
Okay, so they're not putting all their eggs in the biological basket.
Nope. And that brings us to the second article, which is where things get really interesting.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
This one's by Dr. E.A. Bennett, and he throws out a completely different theory.
Wow. What does he say?
He argues that perversions aren't some leftover piece of childhood sexuality, but rather reactions to abnormal circumstances in a person's life.
Okay, so shifting the focus from biology to life experience.
Exactly. And the key relationship he hones in on is the one with the mother.
That's interesting. He's looking at the impact of early relationships on later development.
Yeah, and to illustrate his point, he uses this case study that, well, it's pretty intense.
I'm all ears.
It involves a 29-year-old married man who has a specific perversion for young girls.
Okay, that's definitely going to be a challenging case to unpack.
You're telling me, and I know this might sound shocking to our listeners, but stick with us, because understanding this man's behavior, at least through Dr. Bennett's eyes, is where things get really insightful.
Right, we have to try to see it through the lens of his theory and the time period.
Exactly. So, to get into the specifics, this man's desire was for what he called a wet kiss from a little girl.
Wet kiss?
Yeah, that's what he called it. And what's even more unsettling is how he describes what makes certain girls more appealing to him. He mentions things like rosy, moist lips and a come-hither look, and a desire for complete, unobstructed intimacy.
Whoa, okay. I'm already seeing some red flags here, but let's hear how Dr. Bennett analyzes this.
Well, he suggests that this man's early experiences with his own mother, particularly a pattern of receiving and then being denied affection, somehow shaped his longing for this specific type of connection.
Okay, so he's suggesting there's a connection between the man's early childhood experiences and his adult behavior.
You got it. And this is where his theory about early attachment comes in. He's basically saying that disruptions in that mother-child relationship can have profound and potentially damaging consequences. It makes you wonder if he's almost trying to recreate that mother-child bond, but in a really messed up way.
It's a disturbing thought, for sure. But that's the crux of Dr. Bennett's argument. He's saying that early attachment plays a huge role in shaping our desires and behaviors later in life.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this, but it's still pretty heavy stuff.
It is, and believe it or not, we're just scratching the surface here. Dr. Bennett goes even deeper, analyzing this man's attempts to achieve what he calls early serenity.
Early serenity, I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, it's not a common term, not really. It seems to be more like Dr. Bennett's own way of describing a state of complete, unquestioning connection that he thinks this man associates with early childhood, particularly with his mother.
So almost like a feeling of perfect belonging and security.
Exactly. And according to Dr. Bennett, all of this man's actions, even ones that seem totally contradictory, are attempts to recapture that lost feeling.
That's a fascinating idea, but how does it actually play out in this case study? What are some examples?
Well, remember how he mentioned stealing a baby's teeth and finding it strangely satisfying?
Yeah, it was a really odd detail.
Right. Well, Dr. Bennett interprets that as a symbolic act, like he's trying to recapture that feeling of pure, unadulterated connection that he yearns for.
So he's literally trying to go back to infancy to find that sense of belonging.
That's what Dr. Bennett suggests. And it's not just about that one act. There's also his talk about wanting to hit out and feeling hemmed in. These bursts of aggression that seem completely at odds with his desire for this gentle, infantile connection.
That is strange. So how do those fit into the picture?
Well, Dr. Bennett sees these aggressive impulses as another manifestation of his struggle to regain that lost early serenity. It's like he's lashing out against anything that prevents him from achieving that state of complete connection.
So both the seemingly childish actions and the aggression are driven by the same underlying need.
That's the idea. And it gets even more complex when we consider that, according to Dr. Bennett, this man's perversion itself, his desire for a specific type of connection with young girls, is yet another way of seeking that lost serenity.
So you're saying it's not just about sexual gratification, but about something much deeper.
Exactly. It's about seeking a sense of complete acceptance of uncomplicated intimacy that he associates with his early relationship with his mother.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So, in a way, his perversion is like a distorted attempt to recreate that early mother-child bond.
That's essentially what Dr. Bennett is proposing.
It's a really disturbing concept, but it also makes you think about how complex these issues are. We're not talking about simple black and white morality here.
Exactly. There are layers upon layers of psychological and emotional factors at play.
It definitely makes you rethink how you view the word perversion. It's less about right and wrong and more about trying to understand the incredibly complicated tapestry of human behavior and motivation.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And that's what makes Dr. Bennett's work so fascinating even today. He challenges us to look beyond the surface and consider the deeper human needs that might be driving actions that, at first glance, seem completely inexplicable.
It's a powerful reminder that even behaviors that we might find shocking or repulsive could stem from a place of longing and unmet needs.
And that empathy and understanding are crucial, even when we're dealing with the most challenging aspects of human behavior.
So well said. I'm really intrigued by this whole idea of early serenity and how it ties into all of this. Can you tell me more about what Dr. Bennett means by that term and how it connects to his overall theory about perversions?
I'm happy to. It seems like early serenity is the key to understanding Dr. Bennett's whole perspective. And to fully grasp its significance, we need to explore how he connected to another surprising concept. The idea that perversions and what he calls psychoneuroses actually share a common root.
Okay, now we're talking. So we're not just looking at perversions in isolation anymore. We're talking about a connection to wider mental and emotional struggles.
You got it. And that connection is what we'll be diving into next. Buckle up.
Our listeners better get ready because this deep dive is about to go even deeper.
So before we went on, we were just about to get into this link that Dr. Bennett draws between perversions and psychoneuroses.
Right, it's like a cliffhanger.
Totally. But before we can even understand that connection, we have to go back to this whole early serenity thing.
Okay, back to the basics.
It's not really basic though, is it?
You're right, it's a pretty complex idea.
Exactly. So just to recap, Dr. Bennett uses that term, early serenity, to describe a state of complete connection and belonging that he thinks this man experienced in early childhood.
Yeah, that sense of total unity with the world, especially with mother.
Exactly. And Dr. Bennett's argument is that when that early serenity is disrupted, it can create this kind of fundamental wound.
A wound.
Well, not a literal wound, of course. More like a psychological wound, a sense of being fragmented and disconnected that the person carries with them into adulthood.
Like a piece of them is missing.
Yeah, and they're constantly trying to find it to make themselves whole again.
And that's where the connection between perversions and psychoneuroses comes in.
Exactly. Dr. Bennett believes that both are ultimately attempts to heal that wound, to recapture that lost sense of wholeness.
Okay, but how? How can things as different as, sexual perversions and what we might call mental health issues today come from the same place?
Well, remember, in Dr. Bennett's view, perversions are all about seeking a specific type of connection, often through behaviors that society considers unacceptable.
Right, even harmful in some cases.
Exactly. But the point is, they're driven by that same yearning for closeness, for that feeling of total acceptance and belonging.
It's like they're trying to fill that void with something, even if it's something that doesn't really work or even makes things worse.
You got it. And psychoneuroses, which we don't really use that term anymore, but it covers things like anxiety disorders, depression,
The stuff we see therapists for today.
Exactly. These can also be seen as attempts to cope with that underlying feeling of fragmentation.
So like someone with anxiety might be constantly worrying and trying to control everything because they lack a sense of security.
And that need for security ultimately stems from that early disruption in connection. Yeah.
It's like a domino effect.
Kinda, yeah. And someone with depression might withdraw from the world because they feel fundamentally unlovable.
Which again could trace back to those early experiences.
Right, so they're both trying to solve the same problem, this feeling of being broken or unattached, as the man in the case study put it. But they go about it in totally different ways.
So one is seeking a specific, often inappropriate type of connection, and the other is trying to protect themselves from more pain.
I like that. That's a good way to put it. And what Dr. Bennett is saying is that we need to look beyond those surface level differences and see them as expressions of that same basic human need.
The need for connection, for belonging, for wholeness.
Exactly. It really challenges us to rethink how we view these behaviors. It's not just about judging them as right or wrong.
It's about understanding where they come from.
Exactly. Yeah. And recognizing that even in those behaviors that we might find really disturbing, there's often a flicker of that basic need for love and acceptance.
It's a pretty powerful idea. But it also makes you wonder, if that's the root of the problem, how do we actually address it?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? And it's something we're going to explore in our next segment.
I can't wait. Okay, so we've been talking about Dr. Bennett and all of his theories, but I'm still a little bit fuzzy on how it all works in real life.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to see how these old theories apply to our lives today.
Exactly. Like, it's one thing to talk about early serenity and the need for connection, but how does that actually translate into helping people?
Well, that's what we're going to try to unpack now. We're going to look at some real-world examples of how Dr. Bennett's ideas could actually inform how we understand and approach human behavior.
Okay, I like where this is going. Give me an example. How would understanding this need for early serenity actually help someone who's struggling with what Dr. Bennett calls a perversion?
Let's say you have someone who's struggling with a harmful sexual compulsion.
Okay, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. But instead of just focusing on trying to suppress that behavior, what if therapy also explored their early childhood experiences? Like, were there disruptions in their attachment to their parents or caregivers? Did they experience a lack of belonging?
So, you're saying that we're not excusing the behavior, but we're trying to understand the deeper emotional needs that might be driving it.
Exactly. And by addressing those needs, we might be able to create a more lasting change.
Okay, I'm following you. So, how would we actually address those needs?
Well, there are a lot of different approaches. Therapy that focuses on building secure attachments, fostering self-compassion, strengthening social connections.
It's almost like we're treating the root cause, not just the symptom.
Exactly. And it's an approach that could be applied to a lot of different issues, not just what Dr. Bennett calls perversions.
So you're saying that it could apply to things like addiction, too?
Absolutely. Think about it. With addiction, we don't just tell people to stop using. We try to understand what void they're trying to fill with drugs or alcohol, what pain they're trying to numb.
It's all about understanding the underlying emotional needs.
Right. And it all goes back to Dr. Bennett's idea that even behaviors that we might consider unacceptable often stem from a basic human need for connection and belonging.
That makes a lot of sense. So how about psychoneuroses? How would understanding this whole early serenity thing help us deal with things like anxiety or depression?
Let's take social anxiety as an example. Someone with social anxiety is often really worried about what other people think of them, right? They might avoid social situations, have trouble forming close relationships.
Yeah, I know a few people like that.
And through Dr. Bennett's lens, we might see that anxiety as stemming from a lack of that early sense of secure connection and belonging.
So they might have experienced some kind of disruption in their early attachments, and now they're afraid of rejection.
Exactly. And that fear can really hold them back in life.
So therapy could focus on helping them build a stronger sense of self-worth, challenge those negative beliefs about themselves.
And maybe even practice engaging in social situations without feeling so threatened.
And what about depression? How would we approach that?
Well, depression often involves feelings of isolation and hopelessness.
Right, like they feel unworthy or unlovable?
Exactly. So therapy might focus on cultivating self-compassion, building a supportive social network, helping them find things that bring joy and meaning to their life.
It's amazing how all of these seemingly different issues can be traced back to those early childhood experiences.
It is, and that's the power of Dr. Bennett's work. It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to recognize that we're all more alike than we might think.
We all have that same basic need for connection, for love, for belonging.
And even in the darkest corners of human experience, you can often find a flicker of that need.
Wow, that's beautifully put. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today, and I have to say, I've learned a lot from diving into Dr. Bennett's theories with you.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope our listeners have found it insightful too.
I'm sure they have. And who knows, maybe it's even given them some new ways of thinking about their own lives and the people around them.
We can only hope.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. A huge thanks to our expert for sharing their knowledge with us.
My pleasure. Always happy to geek out about this stuff.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. Remember, there's always something new to learn. Always